Welcome to the Australasian Bayesian Network Modelling Society Webinar Series. Our vision is to provide practical and free information about Bayesian network modelling so that you can use this tool in what you do best. For more great content, you can follow us on Twitter, check out our website, and subscribe to our channel. Please enjoy today's webinar.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that very lovely introduction. So all those acronyms and things basically mean I am in the business of connecting business, government, and industry with mathematical sciences, which includes computer science and statistics. So that's basically my role here, and this is one of the projects that came up in part of doing that. So for those of you who are new to archives, I'm going to give a brief description of what archives are for and why they're valuable. What is the problem we're trying to solve? The integrating decision support system, in very brief, but I'll just give you a reference if you're interested in looking that up. And then this diagram project, so how we went about it, how we collaborated with the archivists, the problems we had around data and how we solved those, the tool that came out of it, and actually we've had a couple of bits of international recognition for the project, which is also nice. Most of all, I'm proud of the fact that it's actually a tool that's being used, but the international recognition is quite nice. So why are archives critical? Well, they tell us who we are. Without some idea of our personal history, our family history, our national history, our community history, we don't really know who we are, and it's very important part of our identity to have that preserved. It's also important for law and order. So in the UK, we've had a stadium disaster, and those records are not public yet because it's still going through the courts, even though the disaster was in the 1980s. But having that record reliably kept of who did what in which order is really important for sorting out issues of liability and recommendations for future. And also the key point of democracy is that we can hold our governments to account. And so keeping records of governments who did what, in what order they did them, the laws that have been passed, the laws that have been repealed, and so on, is very, very important. And there's a very nice quote there from John Sheridan, who's the digital director of the National Archive in the UK. And it talks about how will people know who they are tomorrow if they're relying on us. And the fact that archives root us through evidence. So the National Archive in the UK is the official archive of the UK government and is required by law to keep forever the records of government. And this is about 250 government departments. And as you can well imagine, the records are getting more complex. So emails with multiple attachments and embedded metadata, videos at higher and higher resolutions. In the world of deepfakes, recordings that are able to be distinguished from real thing from the deepfake. Sound recordings and so on, even algorithms, for example, about who can stay in the country. If those are used, then it's important then to be able to go back and say, well, was this algorithm working properly? How was it constructed, and so on and so forth. And again, John Sheridan is telling us that they have over a petabyte of digital records, and also that they're providing a digital safe haven for the archives in Ukraine. It's very important that the Ukrainian history is not rewritten depending on the outcome of the war, and so they can keep their identity safe. We know that one of the things that the Russian president is saying is that there's a deep spiritual connection between Russia and Ukraine, which justifies the actions that they are taking. And we can only know if that is true or false by looking at records. So in order that this project might be wider than the National Archive itself, the National Archive have brought on board some partner archives, typically much smaller, that have a particular focus. So the Dorset History Centre and Gloucestershire Archives, Transport for London Archives, which is particularly looking at the transport around London and that particular company, University Archives from Brighton and from Leeds. And this meant that the perspectives that we were getting out of them throughout the project were not just big, well-funded, but actually small and not so well-funded archives. So unsurprisingly, the act of preserving digital records is called digital preservation. And there are a wide variety of risks to digital records, and they are connected. And it's relatively new in archival terms. A lot of archives are still working with analog materials. And it takes a while when something new happens to get to the point where you know what data to collect in order to make good decisions. And there's also a sort of a human side of it, that admitting something's gone wrong either within your organization or between organizations does make you vulnerable in that sense, and people might not want to admit to that. And as I said, they have to preserve some records forever, and archivists like to say that digital records last forever or 5 years, whichever comes first. And then what do they have to do? They have to preserve the original bit stream to render it sufficiently for use. And even that idea of what is the original when it's digital is quite an interesting philosophical question, and we had some really interesting hours looking at that. So the challenges come from the software, which, as we well know, goes obsolete and is no longer supported after a while, the storage mediums themselves, hardware, lifespans, copying errors. If you're going to have to refresh your copy because the carrier is going to deteriorate, then you've got to copy it. But then if you copy it, are the copy errors? And compression storage. So if you upload your photos to Facebook, for example, and they are compressed on the way, you can't retrieve the uncompressed version very easily. And there are still physical risks, as there are with analog materials. And as John Sheridan here says, trying to sort out which issues they try to preempt, which do they problem solve when they're needed. If they have several copies, how many? Where should they be kept? What the renewal strategy should be were all open questions that needed to be answered, and to which Diagram has provided a solution. So the key question that we set out in the theoretical side of this to answer is, how can we network together inputs from disparate expert domains in a coherent way, and taking account of the uncertainties? And so we developed a statistical methodology called the Integrating Decision Support System, which has had lots of applications, and Diagram is one of those. And the idea here is just that users of decision centers or a board of directors or the management board, they want to do what the right thing is. They're not fighting amongst themselves. They know what their measure of success, their utility is. They understand they have a consensus about how things work, what the system looks like, also who to ask for expertise, and even within that expertise, those experts might be running complex models. So here is the reference if you want to go and dig a bit deeper into integrating decision support system methodology, but I'm happy to talk more about that later. And just here an illustration that this is very much a white box. One of the things in the paper that we proved was that a Bayesian network can be used. I went through this at the conference, but if you want some more detail, do ask me at the end and I will go back to this slide. So how did we progress with the National Archive project? So first of all was the soft elicitation. So what does the model look like? What is the interplay between the factors? What factors need we consider? What granularity is right? And then we went away and did some model building. It's easy to write one bullet point. It took 2 years. And then we had to quantify the model once it was settled. Where was the data? Structured expert judgment for where the data was missing. And then evaluation and feedback from the users about whether it was usable and understandable. And then we had, because we were in lockdown, we had some money left over because we weren't having face-to-face meetings, and we invested in software engineering to build research level code up to commercial level. And that was really well worth doing, and I shall definitely be budgeting for that in the future. Really excellent piece of investment there. And then the launch and the adoption of the tool itself. So as I'm sure this audience knows very well, any essential starting point for a problem is to interact with the problem owners, their advisors, their experts, stakeholders. We need to understand their perspectives, their views, their values, their uncertainties, and their worldview if we're going to make a tool which is right for them. So the questions we start with are, what are the processes, inputs, outputs, actors, perceptions of cause and effect? So what are the factors involved in digital preservation? How does it come in? How does it go out? How do you do it at the moment? what affects what. If you get a problem at one point, do you get a problem at another? So what do you want out of this tool? What do you want to know? What is the question? And that's, you think that problem owners would know that, but often if you've worked with problem owners, you'll realize that it actually takes a little bit of a conversation to really nail that down for them, and because they need to be it needs to be sort of discussed. So how is the modelling done at the moment? How might it be useful to do it? If we're presenting outputs, what would make intuitive sense to somebody who's actually in the domain itself? And of course, it's an iterative process. So digital preservation, they say, is a mission to send messages to the future. They must be faithfully transmitted, but we are not static in our world. There are threats that are changing, the way we do things are changing. Archives' resources to deal with threats is not always easy to see what was to do next. A lot of archives are funded on the basis of projects, and once the project is over, the funding is also over. So actually, when you have the money, what should you do, and how do you invest? So after those long conversations over several months, in fact, this is the network we came up with. So there are two attributes to the utility: renderability and intellectual control. So you can see at the bottom here, these are the two attributes of the utility, and there are some things like information management which feed into both of them. Some of them just feed into one. Technical skills are really important, both for rendering, technical metadata, bit preservation. There's all sorts of things here. Getting this out and getting the right granularity was really hard. And then the next thing we have to do is say, okay, that's great. We have a concept map of what the system looks like, what the influences are, principal influences are. Now, where is the data? Because the nodes have to be measurable, we had to define each of the nodes. What do we exactly mean? And we had to write this down, exactly what we meant by things. There were some surveys within the industry and some previous research. The National Archive had some statistics which it had collected, but often the data granularity wasn't right. So it's often related to sort of a specific brand of, say, magnetic tape, and it was kind of too specific for our purposes. We needed a more general, what does magnetic tape as a storage medium, how long does it last, what are the problems with it? So we then dived into structured expert judgment for the data we didn't have. And in case you haven't seen this before, I'll talk to Anka, she kind of invented this. So this is a way of doing it, my favorite protocol, I have to say. So after having identified your relevant experts and possibly sent out some background briefing papers, you ask them to give a private estimate. And the idea is you're trying to eliminate some of the cognitive frailties that, when you're actually asking people to name numbers. Then you have a facilitated discussion so that everybody gets a say and the loud people don't get too much of a say. And then the second private estimate. And the reason for that is that you may have some kind of social pressures in there to agree with the big name or somebody who's your boss or whatever. And we want to eliminate those as best we can. And then we do some aggregation, and we did an aggregation based on expert performance, because we had calibration questions in there, and those are questions that the analysts have the answer to, but require the same kind of thinking process as the questions of interest. And that means that you can actually score people's performance. Are they overconfident? Are they accurate? And so on. And this is an example of what we got out after the first round. So you can see we had 19 experts. And you can see that some of them had very wide uncertainty bands, like this one here, and these two here and here. They were very uncertain. And we have to ask questions like, well, do you think the system is uncertain, or are you personally uncertain? And we have somebody here who was very, very confident, but way off the pace compared to where most people were. So these lines, people are asked to give a lowest plausible value for the answer, a highest plausible, and their best estimate. And so going through this, we would display it anonymously like this. So we just have these nobody's name is there. They're allowed to identify themselves, of course. And then we say things like, under what circumstances could it be as low as this or as high as this? And then we often find with the calibration questions, in the second round, they move towards the truth. So, and we expressed every question out of 1,000 born digital files, because people find it much easier to imagine a sort of natural frequencies. So this is what the tool now looks like. It's up online and is being used. It's called a prototype because the National Archive is subject to government regulations on accessibility, and there are still a few accessibility, so people who are sight impaired or hearing impaired or whatever, to quite iron out, but it's getting there. It's getting there quite quickly. So this is the top half of the page you would see if you went and had a look at it, and this is the bottom half, and you'll recognize this network. It's just the colored version of the one we had already. And this is because it's important that the archivists really understand what is being measured. And maybe they would disagree with some of the arrows, maybe they don't apply in their country or to their particular archive for a different reason. And it's important that they know what they're using and that they're using something that is appropriate. So the way it works is you answer a bunch of questions. I think there's something like 16 questions of things that you should know about your archive, and that then adjusts the underlying probability tables behind each of these nodes so that you can get a score for your archive. And it looks at something a bit like this. On the right, like a stacked bar chart, remember we had intellectual control and renderability as the two attributes of the utility. There's also two models embedded in there, one that's a bit like the National Archive, so a well-funded one, and a bit which is like just commercial backup, just took it on the cloud, because you want to know if you get a score of, as in the middle one, a score of 12, is that good or bad? So every archive will have its own funding pressures, but it actually allows you to then go back and play with the tool and say, well, what if we had an extra person at this level of a skill, or what if we had, you know, a better replication rate or whatever. And you can see how the different, you know, elements of intellectual control and renderability do actually change. And the National Archive has been able to make a business case using the diagram tool 2 years running, and gone to government for significant uplifts in funding, because they're now able to quantify what the funder will get for their money. So in 2020, we were finalists in the Digital Preservation Awards, which was very nice, and they picked out this, you know, about winning the case for investment as a very important aspect of what the tool provides, which hadn't been provided before. And on the bottom block, there is a user who was using it for a private archive, but really commented on how easy it was to use, and the kind of outputs, those stacked bar charts that you saw, the sort of visualization that senior managers would find informative and useful. And then just a very few weeks ago, 6 weeks ago or so, we were told that we had won the 2022 Decision Analysis Practice Award, which is organised every year by the Decision Analysis Society and the Society for Decision and Professionals. So that was also a very nice thing to win. But for me, the most important thing, the most exciting thing about this project is that there is now a tool out there that is being useful to preserve our national memory. And I'm very proud to be part of this project.